For adding cart items, we need to go to the cart provider, because that's where we manage our cart data in the end. And here we get this add item to cart handler. Now, whenever this function is called, we get the item that should be added to the cart. And then I basically want to check if that item is already part of the cart. So if we, for example, already have sushi in the cart, and if that's the case, I want to update the existing item. If it's not the case, I want to add a new item. And of course, we want to manage this as state in this component so that this component and therefore the context and therefore any components affected by that context are re-evaluated whenever the cart data changes. So here we want to import useState or useReducer. Both are React hooks which allow us to manage state. And I will go for useReducer here because this will be a bit of a more complex state which we're managing here. Because we'll have to check whether a meal is already part of the cart or not. And for removing, we'll also have more complex logic. Hence, I will use useReducer for managing the state here. And therefore, as a next step, outside of this component function, I'll add my cart reducer function. Outside of the component function, because this reducer function won't need anything from that component. It won't need any surrounding data defined in this component. And it shouldn't be recreated all the time when the component is re-evaluated. Now you learned that in the reducer functions, you receive a state object and an action automatically by React. The action is dispatched by you later in your code, and the state is simply the last state snapshot of the state managed by the reducer. And then, as part of the reducer function, you have to return a new state snapshot. Now for this, I'll define another constant outside of the component function and outside of the reducer function, and that's my default cart state. Now that's simply an object where I say that I have no items, so an empty array, and a total amount of 0, therefore. And then it's this default cart state which I return here in cart reducer. Now with that, in cart provider, at the very top of this component function, we can call useReducer, this React hook which we're importing. And now as a first argument, we point at our reducer function here. We don't execute it, we just point at it. It will be executed by React for us then. And we set an initial state, and that's the default cart state. So I'm reusing that constant here. Now you learned that useReducer returns an array with exactly 2 elements. Hence we can use array destructuring to pull these elements out of that array and store them in separate constants. The first array element is always your state snapshot. So I will name it cart state here. The second element is this function which allows you to dispatch an action to the reducer. So I will name it dispatch cart action. Both names are up to you because it's the position which matters here in array destructuring. Now the cart state is now needed to construct this cart context object. Instead of hard coding the empty array here, I will access cart state.items, because we're now managing the items with state, and the total amount with cart state.totalamount. Now we can start dispatching actions. And I want to start with adding items to the cart. Here we can then dispatch a cart action. And as I explained when I introduced the useReducer hook earlier in the course, it's totally up to you what an action is. It could just be a number or a text, but typically it's an object which has some property which allows you to identify that action inside of your reducer function. So that in that reducer function, you can run different pieces of code depending on which action type was dispatched. And I will use type as a property name for identifying the action, but it's totally up to you how you name this. You could also name it identifier or whatever you want. But I will go with type and then follow this convention of having a string all caps identifier. Again, it's also just a convention, but a very readable and common one, which is why I will stick to it. And then here we have, let's say, a type of add. It could also be add item or add card item or whatever you want, but I'll keep it simple and short and just use add. Now, to add the item in the reducer function, I also want to forward the item as part of the action. So I will add a second property to this action object and name it item. This name is also up to you, and point at my item argument here, so that I'm forwarding the item, which I expect to get here on this function, to my reducer. And now we can go to the card reducer and start adding logic for adding a card item here. For this, I first of all want to add a if check and check if the action type is equal to add, because I only want to run this adding logic for this kind of action. At the moment, it is the only action type we have, but later we'll also have a remove action. If we want to, we can already dispatch this here, by the way. We can already add type remove here and forward the ID, let's say, like this in the remove item from card handler. Now we would have, theoretically at least, two kinds of actions which trigger this reducer, and therefore we want to check for which type of action it was triggered. And now in here, I want to update my card items. We could simply add our item as a new item in that array, but as I mentioned, I want to group items for the same meal together and manage the amount on a per meal basis. I also want to update the total amount, the total price, for all aggregated card items. Now let's start simply add an item as a, item to the array though. And for this, we can simply create an array, maybe name it updated items, and set this equal to state items, so the items in the current state snapshot, which we get as a first argument in the reducer by React, and call concat. Concat is a built-in method in JavaScript which adds a new item to an array, but unlike push, it doesn't edit the existing array, but return a new array. And that's kind of important. You want to update your state in an immutable way, which simply means you don't want to edit your old state snapshot because of the reference value thing in JavaScript. That would mean that existing data in memory gets edited without React knowing about it. But instead, you want to generate a brand new state object, which you return. And concat gives us a brand new array instead of editing the old array in memory, which is better. And we want to concat this item, this action item to be precise, which we're getting. And I simply expect to have all the data I need on that action item. So the name, the amounts of items that should be added, the price. I expect to have all of that on the item which reaches this add item to card handler. Currently, we're not taking care about this yet in the other parts of the application, but we will do so in the future. Now, with that, we got the updated items. I also want to get my new total amount, or my updated total amount. And that should simply be the old total amount on the old state snapshot, plus, action.item.price times action.item.amount. So I expect to have an amount field on that item which we're getting, and a price field. And of course, if we multiply these two, we know by how much our total amount needs to change. And with that, we can return our new state. At the moment, I'm not checking whether our item is already part of the array, by the way. That's something we'll add in the future. For the moment, I will simply return a new state snapshot where I set items equal to updated items and total amount equal to updated total amount. And now we got this basic cart reducer finished. Now we need to make sure as a next step that add item to cart handler is being called from some components in our application, like the meals component, where we have all these meal items and the meal item form, with the appropriate data. So with an amount field on every item, with a price field on every item, with a name field on every item, with an ID field on every item. That's what I want to work on next. So let's now make sure that this add item to cart handler is being called. And for that, we need to go to the place where we want to call add item on our context object. And that's in our meal item form in the end. There, we of course want to handle the form submission, so when this button is clicked. And when the form is submitted, we in the end want to, well, add that item to the cart, because that's what this form is there for. So as a first step in the meal item form component, we can add our submit handler function, where we get the event object, which is sent as an argument automatically when we call this function upon a built-in event. And I want to call this function, or I want to have that function called for the onSubmit event, or the submit event on that form here. So here I point at the submit handler. Now you learned that here we should call event prevent default to make sure that that browser default of reloading the page is prevented. And then I want to extract the entered amount. Now I want to use refs for that. The alternative would be two-way binding by managing some state, but I want to use refs. Now the thing is that here I actually have a separate component, a custom component. Normally we can use refs by importing useRef from React. And then we create a ref and we assign that with the ref property or with the ref prop to an element. Generally, we can do that here as well. I can call useRef and create my amount input ref like this. Now I would want to pass that to the ref prop, but since this is a custom component, the ref prop doesn't work, at least not out of the box. Instead, I also taught you how you can make refs work on custom components. I showed you how this works earlier in the course. All we have to do is go to the component where we wanna receive refs. In this case, that's the input component in the UI folder. And then make sure you import React in there from React and wrap your component function with React forward ref. So that component function is now an argument to forward ref. Then you get the ref, which can now be set through the ref prop on your component as a second parameter here. And you can now use it inside of your component function to forward that ref to that input here. So here I can now set the ref prop on the input element to my ref parameter. And that's this forwarded ref, which is the ref which is being set here on my input component. With that, we can now get access to the input through refs. And that allows me to read that entered value in my submit handler function. There we can get the entered amount by accessing amount input ref.current. It's always .current for refs created with useRef.value. Because amount input ref.current will point at the input element, which is stored in that ref in the end. And then every input element by default has a value property which holds the currently entered value. That value is always a string. Even if the input is of type number, it's always a string. So we can convert it to a number by adding the entered amount number, or however you want to name it, by simply adding a plus in front of entered amount. And this will convert the string number to a number. And then we can add a little if check for validation, where we check the entered amount as text, trim it to remove any white space, and check if that's maybe empty, so if no value was entered, or if the entered amount as number is smaller than 1, or if the entered amount as number is greater than 5. That's a little validation I want to add here. And if either of these conditions is met, so if we make it into this if check, I want to return and not continue with this function execution of this submit handler. I also want to output an error message below my input and button, and therefore I'll manage some state here, which is of course optional, but which I want to do. I'll simply use state because it will be a quite simple state. It will simply control whether this form is valid or not. And I'll set this to true initially, and then extract my two values, the state snapshot and the state updating function. And I'll name it amount is valid and set amount is valid. And if we make it into this if check, we know that the entered input was not valid. So here I'll call set amount is valid and set it to false. And if this is false, then I want to output an error message. So here below the button, I'll output some content conditionally, and I will check if not amount is valid. And if that's the case, I will render a paragraph where I say, please enter a valid amount, 125. So that's just a little addition also to practice state and conditional rendering again. Most importantly, the form submission is now only completed or only fully handled if we have valid inputs. So if we make it past this if check. And here I then want to execute my context method to add a cart item, but I'll not do this in this component. Instead, here I will simply call a function which I expect to get on props, and I'll name it onAddToCart. And I forward my entered amount number. Because the cart item which I want to add needs more data than just the entered amount. In this meal item form though, we only have that amount. We don't have the ID or name or price of that item. That's why I'm not calling the context method here, but why I'm just calling some other function, which I expect to get through props, to pass the entered and validated amount number to that function. And now it's the meal item component where that function will be defined. Here I'll add a addToCartHandler function where I get that validated amount as a parameter. And I pass a pointer to that function to the meal item form on that onAddToCart prop, which I'm executing in that form component. So here to that prop, I pass a pointer at this addToCartHandler function. And now in the addToCartHandler function, I want to reach out to my context. So therefore, in the meal item component, I also want to get access to my context. So here I will import useContext from React, and then simply call useContext. And we now need to import the context to which we want to get access. So cart context from going up and going up again, store cart context, the file with a dash in the file name, and pass this to useContext to establish a connection. And then here we have our cart context, and in addToCartHandler, we can now call cart context add item, which is one of the methods defined in our context. Here, we're pointing at the add item to cart handler. And I'm calling that function here. And to that function, we now need to pass this item, right? That's what we're expecting here. We expect to get the item which we forward to the reducer. So it's that item which I want to pass to add item, and hence I create a new object on the fly with an ID which I expect to get through props here. So props ID. With a name which I get through props name, which we're already outputting down there. We don't need to pass on the description, but I do want to set an amount field, which points at the amount we're getting here. And I do want to add a price field, which points at props price. Not this formatted price, but the price as a number, which we get on props. So now we just need to make sure that we also get props ID, and therefore in the available meals component, where we render all the meal items, I will now also set a ID prop and forward meal ID. And with that, we should be triggering that context method whenever that form is submitted. And that should then add items to the cart. So if we save this, we reload, if I click add here, you see that batch number updated. And it updates whenever I click add. Now the cart logic isn't the final logic I want to have yet, but at least we can see that the context is already working now. Now let's make sure that here, when we open the cart, we are outputting the actual cart.